The fluorescent lights of St. Michael's Hospital cast harsh shadows across Dr. Sarah Chen's face as she stared at the complaint letter in her hands. After 6 years of dedicated service in the emergency department, countless lives saved, and endless nights sacrificing her personal life for her patients, it all came down to this moment. "We demand a different doctor," the letter stated coldly. "Someone more suitable for our family's status. Dr. Chen's appearance and background do not meet our standards." The words burned into her mind as she remembered the previous night's events. The Henderson family, one of the wealthiest in Boston, had brought their teenage daughter Emma in with severe abdominal pain. Sarah had diagnosed appendicitis within minutes, preparing for immediate surgery. But when Thomas Henderson, the family patriarch, discovered she would be performing the procedure, everything changed. "You expect me to trust my daughter's life to someone who probably got here through affirmative action?" His words had cut through the emergency room like a knife. "Look at her clothes, her accent. This is what's wrong with medicine today. We're letting anyone wear a white coat." Sarah's worn sneakers and simple scrubs had never bothered her before. They were practical, comfortable for the long hours she spent on her feet saving lives. But under Henderson's scrutinizing gaze, every scuff mark felt like a scarlet letter broadcasting her humble background. Dr. James Walsh, the chief of surgery, had pulled her aside after the confrontation. "Sarah, maybe it's best if you let Dr. Patterson handle this one. The Hendersons are major donors, and with the new wing construction..." She had stepped aside, watching as Dr. Patterson, tall blonde from Old Money, took over the case. It didn't matter that Sarah had graduated top of her class at Harvard Medical School or that she had the highest success rate in the department. In their eyes, she would always be the scholarship kid who didn't belong. Now, staring at the formal complaint, Sarah felt something break inside her. She had spent years trying to prove herself, working twice as hard as her colleagues, taking extra shifts, never complaining. But some barriers seemed insurmountable, built not of brick and mortar, but of centuries of prejudice and privilege. Her hands trembled as she opened her desk drawer, pulling out a worn envelope she had carried for months. Inside was an offer from Mass General Hospital. Better pay, better hours, and a fresh start where perhaps her skills would matter more than her background. As she contemplated her decision, her pager buzzed urgently. Multiple trauma incoming, bus accident, several critical patients. Sarah squared her shoulders, tucking both letters into her pocket. The past 24 hours didn't matter now. There were lives to save. Racing down to the ER, Sarah found controlled chaos. Paramedics wheeled in victim after victim, their voices urgent but professional. Male, mid-40s, crush injuries to chest and abdomen. Female, early 20s, head trauma, unconscious. Among the incoming patients, Sarah's heart stopped when she recognized a familiar face. Emma Henderson, the same girl whose family had rejected her care just hours before. She lay unconscious on a gurney, blood matting her blonde hair, her expensive clothes torn and dirty. Behind her, Thomas Henderson rushed in, his earlier arrogance replaced by raw fear. "Please," he begged, grabbing Sarah's arm, "please help her. She was on her way to school when..." Sarah looked at the man who had questioned her competence, who had tried to end her career with a complaint letter. For a moment, the weight of decision pressed down on her, walk away like they had wanted her to do or rise above. In that split second, Emma's monitors began screaming. Her blood pressure was dropping rapidly, internal bleeding. There was no time for prejudice, no time for old wounds. There was only the oath Sarah had taken, the skills she had spent a lifetime honing, and a young life hanging in the balance. "Get her to Trauma 1, Sarah ordered, her voice clear and commanding. "Page CT and tell them we're coming up. Mr. Henderson, your daughter needs emergency surgery, and I'm the best chance she has right now. You can either trust me to save her life, or you can wait for another doctor. Your choice." The world seemed to hold its breath as Thomas Henderson looked at Sarah, really looked at her for the first time. Gone was the focus on her worn shoes or simple clothes. All he saw now was the steady hands of a surgeon, the confident stance of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. "Save her," he whispered. "Please, just save her." Sarah nodded once, already moving towards the trauma room. She had spent her entire career fighting to prove herself, to show that skill and dedication mattered more than background or appearances. Now, in the cruelest twist of fate, she had the chance to prove it to the very people who had tried to tear her down. As the trauma room doors swung shut behind her, Sarah knew this case would either break her completely or become the turning point she had been waiting for. Everything she had learned, every extra hour she had studied, every sacrifice she had made, it all led to this moment. The question was, would it be enough? The operating room hummed with focused energy as Sarah worked to save Emma Henderson's life. Her hands moved with practiced precision, finding and repairing the internal bleeding that threatened to steal this young woman's future. Every movement was deliberate, every decision calculated with years of experience. "BP's dropping," the anesthesiologist announced. "We're losing her." Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, drawing on countless hours of study and practice. She had seen this before, had prepared for this exact scenario. While other surgeons spent their evenings at cocktail parties and charity galas, she had been in the simulation lab, running through complex procedures again and again. "There's another bleeder," she announced, her voice steady despite the pressure. "Suction here, more light." Her fingers found the torn vessel, as found, hidden beneath layers of tissue. This was why she had chosen emergency medicine. These crucial moments where skill and instinct merged, where background and social status meant nothing compared to the ability to act decisively. As she worked, Sarah's mind drifted to a memory from her childhood. Her mother, a house cleaner, coming home exhausted but proud, telling young Sarah, "Education is the one thing they can never take from you." Those words had driven her through years of study, through nights spent poring over medical texts while her classmates attended parties. A soft ping from the monitors brought her back to the present. Emma's vitals were stabilizing. The bleeding was under control. Sarah allowed herself a small breath of relief, but she knew the next few hours would be critical. Outside the operating room, Thomas Henderson paced the waiting area, his expensive shoes wearing a path in the linoleum floor. The man who had demanded a more suitable doctor just hours ago now held on to hope that this same doctor could save his daughter's life. What he didn't know, what no one in the hospital knew, was that Sarah had a personal connection to the Henderson family, one that went back years before she became a doctor. As she finished the final sutures, the memory she had buried deep inside threatened to surface. 15 years ago, Sarah's mother had worked as a housekeeper in the Henderson mansion. Young Sarah, accompanying her mother during summer breaks, had often played with Emma's older sister, Catherine. The girls had formed an unlikely friendship, sharing books and dreams, until Mrs. Henderson discovered them together and fired Sarah's mother on the spot. "The help should know their place," she had said coldly, while Catherine watched helplessly from the top of the grand staircase. That day had changed something in Sarah. The humiliation in her mother's eyes, the crushing weight of social hierarchy, it had all crystallized into a determination that would shape her future. She had promised herself that one day she would stand as an equal to people like the Hendersons, not through wealth or social connections, but through sheer merit and dedication. Now, as she stepped out of the operating room to speak with Thomas Henderson, Sarah felt the weight of that past pressing against her chest. Should she reveal that she was the same little girl his wife had cast out years ago? Would it make any difference? "Mr. Henderson," she began, removing her surgical cap, "Emma's surgery was successful. We found and repaired the internal bleeding. The next 24 hours will be critical, but I'm cautiously optimistic." The man who had looked down on her just yesterday collapsed into a chair, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he whispered. "I was wrong about you. So wrong." But before Sarah could respond, a familiar figure appeared at the end of the hallway. Catherine Henderson, now a successful lawyer in New York. Their eyes met, and Sarah saw the flash of recognition cross Catherine's face. "Sarah," Catherine breathed, taking a step forward. "Sarah Chen?" Thomas Henderson looked between them, confusion evident on his face. "You know each other?" The moment hung in the air, like a suspended drop of water, ready to fall and ripple through their carefully constructed worlds. Catherine opened her mouth to speak, but Sarah cut her off. "We should focus on Emma right now," she said professionally. "She'll need careful monitoring through the night." But as she turned to leave, Catherine caught her arm. "I never forgot," she whispered. "I tried to find you after what happened. I need to tell you something about that day. Something you don't know." Sarah felt her careful professional facade cracking. The past she had tried so hard to leave behind was suddenly rushing back, threatening to complicate an already volatile situation. And somewhere in the hospital, Emma Henderson lay recovering from surgery, unaware that her life had just become entangled with a decades-old story of class division and buried truths. A nurse appeared at Sarah's side, interrupting the moment. "Dr. Chen, we need you in the ICU. Emma's showing signs of post-operative complications." Sarah nodded, grateful for the interruption. "We'll talk later," she told Catherine, already moving toward the ICU, but as she walked away, she could feel the weight of unspoken words and hidden histories pressing down on her shoulders. The next few hours would not only determine Emma's recovery, but would also unravel a web of secrets that had bound these families together for years. As Sarah checked Emma's vitals and adjusted her medications, she couldn't help but wonder, had she saved this girl's life only to open a door to a past she had fought so hard to escape? The ICU's rhythmic beeping provided a steady backdrop as Sarah checked Emma's vitals for the third time in an hour. The girl's condition had stabilized after a brief scare, post-operative fever that had initially sparked concerns about infection. Now, in the quiet of the early morning hours, Sarah found herself alone with her thoughts and the weight of Catherine's unspoken revelation. "Your dedication to my sister is admirable." Catherine's voice came from the doorway, startling Sarah from her contemplation. "But then again, you always were the one who cared more about doing what's right than what was expected." Sarah turned, maintaining her professional composure despite the storm of emotions beneath the surface. "It's my job, Catherine. Nothing more. Is that really all it is?" Catherine stepped into the room, her designer heels clicking softly against the floor. "Or is it about proving something to the people who once made you feel like you weren't enough?" The words hit too close to home, and Sarah felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. "You said you needed to tell me something about that day," she deflected. "What could possibly matter now after 15 years? Catherine glanced at her sleeping sister, then back to Sarah. "My mother didn't fire your mother because she found us playing together," she said quietly. "She fired her because she found something in my father's study, documents that could have destroyed our family's reputation and business." Sarah's hand froze on Emma's chart. "What are you talking about?" "Your mother discovered evidence of my father's illegal business practices, insider trading, manipulation of medical supply contracts with hospitals, including this one." Catherine's voice trembled slightly. "She didn't know what she'd found, but my mother did. Instead of addressing the corruption, they chose to silence the threat." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. All these years, she had carried the weight of that humiliation, believing it was about social class, about not being good enough. But the truth was far uglier. "Does your father know?" Sarah asked, her mind racing. "And about the real reason?" "No," Catherine replied. "My mother never told him. She handled it herself, like she handled everything that might tarnish the family name." She paused, pulling a USB drive from her pocket. "I've spent years gathering evidence, building a case. I'm an attorney now, specializing in corporate fraud. This drive contains everything. The original documents your mother found, plus 15 years of similar practices that have continued to this day." Sarah stared at the small device, understanding the magnitude of what Catherine was offering. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I'm tired of living with the guilt," Catherine admitted. And because you're not just Emma's doctor, you're living proof that merit matters more than money. My father needs to see that, and he needs to face the truth about our family's success." Before Sarah could respond, Emma's monitors began blaring. The girl's blood pressure was plummeting, her oxygen levels dropping rapidly. "She's crashing," Sarah called out, immediately shifting into action. "Code Blue, get a crash cart in here." The next few minutes were a blur of focused intensity as Sarah fought to save Emma's life for the second time in 24 hours. Her hands moved with practiced precision, her mind clear despite the chaos of revelations swirling around her. "Push one of Epi," she ordered, watching the monitors. "Come on, Emma, fight!" Thomas Henderson appeared in the doorway, terror etched on his face as he watched Sarah work to save his daughter. The man who had questioned her qualifications now stood helpless, his wealth and influence meaningless in this critical moment. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was merely minutes, Emma's vitals stabilized. Sarah stepped back, exhausted but relieved, only to find herself face to face with Thomas Henderson. "I don't deserve your help," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Not after how I treated you, not after—" He glanced at Catherine, and Sarah realized he had overheard at least part of their conversation. "How much did you hear?" Catherine asked, tension evident in her voice. "Enough," Thomas replied, his shoulders sagging. "Enough to know that our family's success is built on a foundation of lies and corruption. Enough to know that I've spent years looking down on people like Dr. Chen, while she—" his voice broke, "while she shows more integrity in one day than I have in my entire life." The admission hung in the air, heavy with implications. Sarah looked between father and daughter, seeing the years of deception and privilege beginning to crumble. But before anyone could speak further, Dr. Walsh appeared in the doorway. "Dr. Chen, a word." His tone was clipped, professional, but Sarah could see the tension in his stance. "The board has some concerns about your involvement in this case, given the complaint letter." Sarah felt a surge of anger. Even now, after everything, the politics and prejudices of the hospital system threatened to interfere with patient care. But as she opened her mouth to respond, Thomas Henderson stepped forward. "I need to speak to the board," he said firmly. "Not just about Dr. Chen, but about years of corrupt practices that have gone unchecked. It's time for the truth to come out." The words sent a ripple of shock through the room. Dr. Walsh's face paled as he realized the hospital's biggest donor was about to become its biggest threat. Catherine gripped the USB drive tighter, years of collected evidence about to see the light of day. And Sarah, standing amid the unfolding chaos, realized that saving Emma's life had set in motion events that would change everything, not just for the Hendersons, but for the entire hospital system that had both nurtured and hindered her career. The question now was, who would survive the coming storm? The next 48 hours at St. Michael's Hospital unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of chaos. News of Thomas Henderson's intent to expose years of corruption spread through the hospital's administrative corridors like wildfire. Dr. Walsh had called an emergency board meeting, and the usual quiet efficiency of the hospital's upper floors was disrupted by the constant click of expensive shoes and urgent whispers. Sarah focused on what she did best, caring for her patient. Emma's condition remained critical but stable, each small improvement a victory in itself. The girl had begun showing signs of consciousness, her fingers twitching occasionally, her vital signs growing stronger with each passing hour. "You should go home, get some rest," Catherine said, bringing Sarah a cup of coffee. "You've been here for almost 2 days straight." Sarah shook her head, checking Emma's latest blood work results. "I don't trust anyone else to monitor her right now. Too many people have too much to lose if anything goes wrong." She wasn't being paranoid. Throughout the day, various board members and administrators had found excuses to pass by Emma's room, their eyes lingering too long on monitors and charts. Each time, Sarah positioned herself between them and her patient, a silent guardian against forces she was only beginning to understand. "The board meeting is in an hour," Catherine said quietly. "Dad's going to present everything. Not just about the hospital contracts, but all of it. 15 years of corruption. Bid rigging, kickbacks." She paused, her professional facade cracking slightly. "They're going to try to stop him." As if on cue, Dr. Walsh appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 members of the hospital's legal team. "Dr. Chen, given the sensitive nature of the situation, we believe it would be best if you stepped back from Miss Henderson's case. Dr. Patterson will take over." "No." The voice came not from Sarah or Catherine, but from the hospital bed. Emma Henderson, pale but alert, had opened her eyes. "I want Dr. Chen. She's the only one I trust." The room fell silent. Emma's eyes, so like her father's, fixed on Dr. Walsh with surprising strength. "I heard everything," she continued, her voice weak but determined. "Even when I couldn't open my eyes, I heard. About what our family did, about how we treated Dr. Chen, about the corruption. I heard it all." Sarah moved to Emma's side, checking her vitals even as her heart raced with the implications of this moment. Emma reached out, catching Sarah's hand in a weak but determined grip. "You saved my life," Emma said, "even after how we treated you, even after everything our family did to yours. That's real medicine. That's what this hospital should be about." Dr. Walsh stepped forward, his professional smile strained. "Miss Henderson, you've been through a traumatic experience. Perhaps we should..." "Perhaps," Thomas Henderson's voice cut through the room as he entered, "we should listen to my daughter. And then we should all proceed to the board meeting, where we're going to have a long overdue discussion about the future of this hospital." Sarah looked at her patient, then at the administrators who had tried so hard to push her aside. "Emma needs monitoring. Her condition is still delicate." "Go," Emma insisted. "Catherine will stay with me. You need to be in that meeting. You need to tell your story." The next hour would change everything. As Sarah followed Thomas Henderson and Dr. Walsh toward the boardroom, she felt the weight of years of struggle, determination, and sacrifice pressing down on her. But she also felt something else, a fierce pride in knowing that she had never compromised her principles, never let prejudice or pressure deter her from being the best doctor she could be. The boardroom was packed when they arrived. Hospital administrators, legal teams, and board members filled every seat, their faces a mix of concern and barely concealed hostility. Sarah took her place next to Thomas Henderson, aware of the irony of standing shoulder to shoulder with a man who had tried to end her career just days ago. "Before we begin," Thomas announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to commanding rooms, "I want everyone to understand something. What we're about to discuss isn't just about contracts or kickbacks. It's about the soul of medicine itself." He turned to Sarah, nodding slightly. "Dr. Chen represents everything this hospital should be: excellence without prejudice, dedication without compromise. While we were busy protecting our profits and positions, she was busy saving lives, including my daughter's, twice." The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Thomas began presenting the evidence. Document after document appeared on the screen. Rigged bids, inflated contracts, kickback schemes that had drained millions from the hospital's resources while lining the pockets of administrators and board members. But it was Sarah's testimony that silenced the room. She spoke of her years of dedication, of the subtle and not-so-subtle barriers placed in her way. She spoke of patients who had suffered because decisions were made based on profits rather than care. And finally, she spoke of Emma and how the prejudices of the system had almost cost a young woman her life. "I didn't become a doctor for status or money," she concluded, looking each board member in the eye. "I became a doctor to save lives. Every time you put profit over patient care, every time you let prejudice influence medical decisions, you betray everything medicine stands for." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, from the doorway, came the sound of slow, deliberate clapping. Everyone turned to see Catherine wheeling Emma into the room in a wheelchair, the girl pale but determined, her presence a living testament to everything Sarah had just said. "The press is outside," Catherine announced, her lawyer's smile sharp and certain. "They're very interested in hearing about how St. Michael's Hospital handles patient care and corporate ethics. So, ladies and gentlemen of the board, you have a choice to make." The next few minutes would determine not just Sarah's future, but the future of St. Michael's Hospital itself. As she stood there, surrounded by power brokers and politicians, Sarah realized that sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting the system, but from being willing to tear it down and build something better in its place. The question was, would the board have the courage to do what was right? Or would they force a confrontation that would shake the hospital to its foundations? The boardroom crackled with tension as Dr. James Walsh rose from his chair, his face a mask of practiced concern. "While these allegations are serious," he began, "we must consider the reputation of St. Michael's." "The reputation of St. Michael's," Emma interrupted from her wheelchair, her voice gaining strength, "should be built on the quality of its care, not the size of its donors' checkbooks." She turned to face the board members, her recent brush with death lending weight to her words. "I'm alive because Dr. Chen put her oath above your politics. How many others weren't so lucky?" Sarah watched as the question landed like a physical blow. She thought of all the patients she'd treated over the years, of the battles she'd fought just to provide the care they deserved. But before anyone could respond, the boardroom door opened again. A woman in cleaning scrubs stepped in quietly, and Sarah's heart stopped. Even after 15 years, she would recognize that face anywhere. Her mother, Lin Chen, still working at St. Michael's, as she had since being fired from the Henderson household. "Mom?" Sarah whispered, "What are you doing here?" Lin Chen stood straight, her dignity evident despite her humble uniform. "I'm here because it's time, daughter. Time for all truths to come out." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a worn envelope, yellowed with age. 15 years ago, I found documents in Mr. Henderson's study, but that wasn't all I found." She handed the envelope to Thomas Henderson with trembling hands. "There was also this letter from your wife to Dr. Walsh." Thomas opened the envelope slowly, his face growing pale as he read. This is about bid rigging, but..." He looked up at Dr. Walsh, shock turning to anger. "You and my wife, you were..." "An affair," Catherine finished, her lawyer's instincts connecting the dots. "Mom wasn't just protecting the family's reputation, she was protecting herself, her relationship with Dr. Walsh. That's why she was so desperate to silence your discovery." "Mrs. Chen." The revelation rippled through the room. Dr. Walsh sank back into his chair, years of careful manipulation crumbling around him, but Sarah's mother wasn't finished. "I kept quiet all these years," Lynn continued, "watching my daughter fight against the prejudice you created, watching her work twice as hard to prove herself worthy of a position she had already earned. I cleaned these halls at night, seeing how the corruption you built hurt patients while my daughter tried to save them." She turned to Sarah, tears in her eyes. "I am so proud of you, daughter. You became everything I dreamed you could be. Not because of them, but in spite of them." Emma reached out from her wheelchair, taking Sarah's hand. "We can make this right," she said firmly. "Dad?" Thomas Henderson stood, his decision evident in his bearing. "I move for an immediate restructuring of the board," he announced. "Dr. Walsh's resignation, effective immediately. A full audit of all contracts and practices." He paused, looking at Sarah. "And I move to appoint Dr. Sarah Chen as the new Chief of Emergency Medicine." "You can't do this," Dr. Walsh protested. The consequences, Catherine interrupted, holding up the USB drive, "will be handled through proper legal channels. The only question is whether the board wants to be seen as part of the problem or part of the solution." One by one, the board members looked at Emma in her wheelchair, at Sarah standing tall despite years of prejudice, at Lin Chen, whose quiet courage had finally broken the walls of silence. They saw the truth they had ignored for so long, that real healing required more than just medical skill. It required integrity, compassion, and the courage to stand against injustice. The vote was unanimous. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the newly renovated emergency department, now named the Lin Chen Center for Emergency Care, a testament to the power of perseverance and truth. The changes hadn't been easy. Several board members had resigned. Contracts had been reviewed, and practices had been transformed. Emma had recovered fully, inspired by her experience to apply to medical school herself. "I want to be like you," she had told Sarah. "Someone who sees the person, not the privilege." Thomas Henderson had made good on his promise to reform the hospital's practices, working closely with Catherine to ensure transparency and fairness in all dealings. The hospital was healing, not just bodies, but its own soul. As Sarah prepared to start her shift as Chief of Emergency Medicine, she felt her mother's presence beside her. Lin Chen, no longer a silent witness, but honored as the catalyst for change, smiled at her daughter. "You did it, Mom," Sarah said softly. "You kept the evidence all these years, waiting for the right moment." "No, daughter," Lin replied, straightening Sarah's white coat with pride. "You did it. You showed them that excellence has no class, that healing has no prejudice. You became the change we needed." Sarah looked around at her emergency department, at the diverse staff she had hired, at the updated equipment purchased with honestly negotiated contracts, at the new policies that ensured every patient received the same high standard of care, regardless of their status or wealth. A trauma alert sounded, and Sarah straightened, ready to do what she did best, save lives. As she rushed toward the incoming emergency, she caught her reflection in a window. She saw not just a doctor, but a symbol of transformation, proof that integrity and dedication could overcome even the deepest prejudices. The emergency doors opened, bringing with them the next challenge, the next opportunity to prove that in medicine, as in life, what truly matters is not the privileges we are born with, but the dedication we bring to healing others. Sarah Chen, daughter of a housekeeper, victim of prejudice, turned catalyst for change, stepped forward to meet it. In that moment, she was simply what she had always been meant to be, a healer, ready to save the next life, fight the next battle, and continue the endless work of making medicine truly blind to everything except the sacred duty to care for all who needed help. After all, some victories aren't marked by dramatic confrontations or public revelations. Sometimes the greatest triumph is simply showing up, day after day, proving through quiet excellence that character outweighs class, that dedication defeats discrimination, and that the most powerful catalyst for change is the unwavering commitment to doing what's right. Even now, years later, Sarah's worn sneakers still carried her through the hospital halls. But they were no longer a mark of shame. They were a badge of honor, telling a story of perseverance, integrity, and the triumph of merit over prejudice. In the end, she had not just saved lives, she had helped heal the very institution dedicated to saving them. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. What would you do if faced with a moment that challenges everything you believe in? A moment where your principles and your future hang in the balance? What price would you be willing to pay to stand up for what's right, even when everyone expects you to back down? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters, and we'd love to hear your story. If this journey touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe to join our community. Your support keeps these powerful stories coming every day. Stories that remind us of our shared humanity and the courage to overcome life's greatest challenges. Don't miss our next video. It's a roller coaster of emotions that will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very last second. Trust us, you won't want to miss this one. Click the video on your left to continue this incredible journey. Remember, by subscribing, you're not just following a channel, you're joining a community that celebrates real stories of triumph, courage, and the unbreakable human spirit. Together, we can keep these inspiring stories alive. Thank you for being part of this journey. See you in our next story.